I'm ready to record. So we had a technical difficulty that was my fault. The recording cut off after the break. So here I am a little bit later re-recording the second half of session 2. And we're going to start with, we talked about the phases of sermon prep. We talked about starting of bathing everything in prayer, getting your heart right, studying. How do you study? How do you write is where we're going to go. And then we'll hit how do you internalize the text, what do I mean by that, and how do you pray. So you want to write your sermon so that it's effectively communicated. And so on page 5, phase 3, write, I've got some steps to help you. How do I go about writing? Now that I've studied, now that I've gotten into the text, how do I go about writing? And the first big thing that you want to do when you're writing a message is you want to create a big idea statement that summarizes the message of the text in a compelling way. You want a well-stated one-liner. You want something that if they only get one thing, the whole message is encapsulated into one sentence. And I'm telling you this as something that I kicked and screamed against. I was like, no, I am not going to have one big idea statement because, if you just have one big idea statement, there's too many things going on in the text to have one big idea. But here's the problem. They are only going to remember one point from your sermon. They are only, no matter how great of a communicator you are, if you preach a sermon, they will walk out remembering one thing. And you can confuse them or you can put punch behind one thing. Think about it like this. It is easier to catch a baseball than it is a pound of sunflower seeds. Why? Because it's one thing that you can wrap it around. And so what I always, so 3 marks of a good big idea statement is, first, you want a big idea statement that reflects the meaning of the text. You want a big idea statement that accurately reflects the meaning of the text. From the, we talked about that process of exegesis, biblical theology, and application, that it brings those together, that it shows the meaning of the text, and it applies it to life. So you want a big idea statement that does that. You want to make it succinct. You want to make it so succinct that it's memorable. Here's the test for it. Could you put it on Twitter? Could you put it on Twitter? When we rediscover the literature of our day, we will discover that the literary form of our day was tweets and Facebook posts. Can you get your entire message across in 140 characters or less? In just a way that somebody can literally hear it a couple times and they're like, I remember that for the rest of my life. And so make it tweetable is what I always like to say. And thirdly, make it impactful, make it profound. Do what you have to do to play with it and to master it until you have a great big idea statement. What I will often do in the process of making my big idea statement is I'll just type out a little draft on my computer, my big idea for my message. And you know what I'll do? I'll hit enter, and under that, I will phrase it and rephrase it slightly better and improve it. And you know what I'll do after that? I'll hit enter again, and I will rephrase that big idea statement again and tweak it and mess with it and pull it and put things in, take things out until it is concise and beautiful, and I've got a tweetable big idea statement that is so good I can build an entire message around it. And so if you look on page 7, I did this in the class. I just put some great one-liners from some of my favorite preachers, from Charles Spurgeon to Leonard Ravenhill to Tim Keller. And I just had a moment where I had the people in the class. I just want you to read through these statements. These are 3 very different preachers in their style and in the way they communicate. And I want you to read through these great statements. And I want you to answer me this. What makes these statements effective? What makes these great one-liners? And if you're like, I don't know how to get something into a tweet or to, make something effective and great and effectively communicated in just 140 characters, I'm long-winded. Make it your discipline to get a Twitter account and follow some good tweets. Look for one-liners. Read short sentences that are done well. Read these one-liners. And I'm constantly thinking that because it cultivates the sensibility in you of concise, effective communication. And I find that is a skill that can be cultivated. And they don't even have to be necessarily from sermons. You can find effective communicators no matter what their ideology is, and learn from them, watch them, and see how things are effectively communicated. I feel like I read a ton of Charles Spurgeon's sermons, and Spurgeon is I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but he's a subpar exegete. He's a subpar biblical scholar, but he's a brilliant communicator. And I feel like I read so much of him that I have him in the back of my head, and I can hear how he would phrase things. And if you can take some really great communicators and immerse them in it, you can learn so much. Now, you'll find this interesting. Now, this is no statement on politics. No statement on politics. This is purely a statement on effective communication. But I saw someone ask Bill Clinton how he became such an effective speaker. And this is, again, no endorsement or reprimanding of Bill Clinton and his politics. But they said, how did you become such an effective speaker? And he said, I listened to hours upon hours of sermons by African-American preachers. You're like, what? He doesn't seem like a black preacher. He doesn't have that style. No, but it helped him cultivate, because he saw, even though it was a completely different style and different, rhetoric and different tradition and different world than this, white guy, it made him cultivate that ability to speak well. I'll give you another example. I think Ronald Reagan, on the other end, is also an effective communicator. And he has a line in his campaign when he was running against Jimmy Carter. He said, when your neighbor loses his job, that's a recession. When you lose your job, that's a depression. And when Jimmy Carter loses his job, that's a recovery. Whether it's right or wrong, brilliant way to state it. And I was preaching a sermon on revival, and I was trying to get it together and trying to get a good statement that would carry it. And I just thought about that statement. I said, you know what? When people in other countries get saved, that's missions. When your neighbor gets saved, that's evangelism. And when people in the church get saved and come to Christ, that's revival. And I say that as an example of watching people speak well will inspire you and give you those sensibilities of communicating well. And I think the effectiveness of your message really hinges on this. Again, this is not a reflection on politics, but when I had them in here watching this, I said, can you tell me what Donald Trump's message was? Everyone simultaneously looks at me and says, make America great again. And I said, can you tell me what Hillary Clinton's was? Crickets. And I said, could you tell me what Barack Obama's message was? Immediately, everybody says hope and change. Hope and change. That was his message. That was his slogan. Mitt Romney? No. John McCain? No. What's the difference? They got their message into something that was tweetable, and it stuck. And that was the difference between whether people followed them or didn't follow them, is could they get their message concise and sticky? And it's the same thing for your sermon. If you can get it concise and sticky, people can follow what you're saying. So if you're watching this video, I encourage you to look through page 7. I want you to just look through these one-liners and jot down some notes. Why do you think they're effective? What do you think makes these really great big idea statements for sermons? Page 8. So after you've created your big idea, you want to create a message outline around your big idea and choose a method of organization. We'll talk about different methods of organization, but you're trying to create, I've got my big idea from my text, now I just want to create key statements, kind of micro big ideas that lead to and support my great big idea, all right? And you want to create sort of an outline so that you know where you're going. You want to have a running outline of where you're going. And so you want to form these statements to create your big idea, and then you want to organize them well. I'll say this. the effectiveness of your message, you don't realize this, a lot of it is how well you organize it. If you organize things well, you can take people on a journey. You can move them piece by piece, step by step, to see the biblical truth you're trying to communicate. But if you just have a bunch of random statements that kind of back up your big idea in any random order, you can't have the punch. And so order and structure really matter. And so I'm going to go through, these are 4 basic ways to organize your message. All of them have strengths and weaknesses. I'll talk about that. I'll give examples of these 4 ways of organizing a message. And all of them are appropriate at certain times. I hope you mix it up. I hope you don't pick one of these structures and always do it and get addicted to it, because a great communicator can switch it up and it makes it stay fresh if you can organize your messages in different ways. So the first form of sermon organization, of speaking organization, is deductive organization. Deductive organization. And let me see here. Oh, here we are. Deductive organization. So big idea. This is your message outline B. And so deductive organization is this. You state your big idea up front, and then you give your backing for it. State your big idea up front in deductive organization, and then you give your backing for it. Now, so example, if your big idea statement was God is good, you would say, number 1, God is good. First reason, I know God is good because he cares for us. Second reason, I know God is good because he protects us. Third reason, I know God is good because he gives us grace, right? You had your big idea of God is good up front, and then you backed it up. And so that's one example of that. Another example, kind of deductive organization, stating your big idea up front, is Vodi Bakum. He's a great preacher. His outline template, he has this thing, and this is really helpful for me. State, explain, illustrate, argue, transition. State, explain, illustrate, argue, transition. What does he do? He states his big idea, deductive, and then he explains it. He breaks it down. He explains that big idea statement. Then he illustrates it with a story or a metaphor or an object lesson. And then he argues. He states why someone would object to this big idea and rebuts it. And then he transitions into his next big point, right? And so that's his kind of sermon outline that's deductive in style. So the strength of this, the strength of deductive organization is it's clear and it's easy to follow. It's often, lots of times if you're speaking to children, deductive is the best way to go. It's simple, and when you really need simplicity, deductive is the way to go. The weakness of deductive organization is that it doesn't really create tension. It doesn't really keep you on the edge of your seat. You already know where the preacher is going from the very first thing that they say. And so that's the weakness of it. So it can get boring a little bit. So as an alternative to deductive organization, there is inductive organization, number 2 on page 8. Inductive organization is the exact opposite. You have your big idea, but you don't state it until the very end of your sermon. And you start somewhere without your big idea, and you're slowly but surely leading people to the conclusion of your big idea. Now, you are putting it on the back end. So as an example, back to the God is good, if that's my big idea, I might start off by saying, first it seems that God is angry, but he cannot be angry because he's shown us grace. Then it seems like God does not care, but that could not be true because he's protected us. Third, that's left only one conclusion. God must be good. All right? See what I did there? Instead of just stating God is good up front, I kind of worked with other possible conclusions and shot them down until I left you and cornered you at my big idea. That's inductive organization. Tim Keller uses a form of this, and I love Tim Keller. Hook, book, stuck, crux. Hook. He gives an intro that states what the problem is. He always kind of starts with a problem, and then he goes to the book. What does the Bible say about that problem? He goes kind of into the Bible, and what does it say about that problem? Stuck. He says, what prevents us from doing that biblical solution that he just proposed? And then he ends it with crux. And he brings Christ in and the cross in, and he shows you the solution when you get stuck with that biblical solution, right? And so that's a really effective inductive organization that builds real tension. And then Andy Stanley's is also a spectacular example of inductive organization. He does me, we, God, you, we. Me. He starts off by talking about a dilemma that he faces in his life presently. You know, we had people say who their favorite preacher was, and one of them said Andy Stanley because he can connect. You know why he connects really well is because at the very beginning, he states a personal problem with that he's having or has had or has overcome. And what everybody says when they hear an Andy Stanley sermon is they go, oh my gosh, me too, I struggle with that. If you can talk about something you've personally gone through and then have everybody listening to you say, oh my gosh, me too, I've struggled with that. You've got them. That is what connection is. I have something in common, me too. So he starts with me, and then we. From there, he finds that common ground and says, you know, you all have this same dilemma as me, and then God. And then he transitions into the text to discover what God says about the tension or the question that he's introduced. And then you. And then he looks and he challenges his audience to act on what he just heard from the text. And then back to we. He closes with several statements kind of giving vision of what could happen in our community or church or in the world if we all embrace this principle together. So me, we, God, you, we. That's his inductive thing. Now, the strength of inductive organization is it builds suspense. You think, what the heck is he about to say? What the heck is she about to say? Where in the world is this preacher going? And that keeps people locked in. Now, the weakness is it's a little bit more complicated to follow inductive organization is than deductive, and so you can get people lost. It's not as simple. It's not as easy to follow. And so third method of organization, narrative organization. And so narrative organization, you tell a story, and as you're going through the story, and this works really well with narrative texts, as you're going through the story, you stop and you apply and give your message a little bit. And then you fold back into the story and keep the story going. And then you stop again and you explain where you're going and you apply it and kind of give some teaching. And so that's narrative organization. The strength of narrative organization is people love stories. People love a great story. And if you can build a great story with evolving characters and make things really move, it's incredible. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in the story and deviate from the main point. That's the only problem. It can be a little harder to follow where somebody's going as well. Fourth, and I said deductive is the most simple organization. The most simple for you to write is the fourth type of organization, that's running commentary. What do I mean by running commentary organization? Running commentary is you take the text, you read verse 1, and then you explain verse 1. You read verse 2, and then you explain verse 2. Read verse 3, and then you explain verse 3. And with certain texts, this is the easiest and best way to do it. Chip does this a lot. It's a really great, effective form of communication. And so the strength of it is it addresses every single point in the text. The weakness of it is often, running commentary can often become boring. It can be the least easy to make engaging because it just feels like a commentary. And so you have to have your big idea and form an organization around it, one of these four, and builds on that. So We did the big idea, the message outline and organization. C, third step on page 11 in writing your message is explanations, illustrations, arguments, applications or vision casting, and transitions. Now, you spice up this skeletal outline that you have of your message with your big idea and your main points. Now, I'm going to go through each of those things and talk about how you can build them into your message. So, explanations. You're going to take your big points and you want to explain them. Now, here's the best way to explain something. I call it rigging an epiphany. If you've ever had that moment when something dawns on you and you're like, oh my gosh, I get it now, all right? You are trying to set up people to have that experience with your big idea. You are setting them up to have a, oh my gosh, I get it now. That is the best thing that you can go through. Now, if you, the way you do that is you stage them to realize it for themselves. How do you do that? Look at the way you realized it for yourself. One of the easiest ways to explain something is to walk people through how you yourself realized it and tell the story of how it came to you. And that is an excellent way to explain something. Another way, if you're looking for another way to explain something and make it clear, is to take your big idea statement, take each word and just define it. And just define each word, define each phrase in your statement, in your sentence. And that way they can break it down. And so that's explanations. Illustrations. The goal of illustrations is to take something abstract and make it tangible. I love doing illustrations. I have a ton of fun with it. And so here's a handful on page 12 of great ways to do illustrations. Stories and testimonies of this is how God did this in my life and a testimony. A great storyteller keeps people on the edge of their seat. And if you can bring somebody into a story to illustrate something really effectively. I heard he was a literary critic, and he made this statement about telling stories, and he said, here's the mark of a great story, that the characters are different people at the end of the story than they were at the beginning. And if I asked you, what are the favorite movies of American cinema, that's so true. I mean, why is Star Wars so compelling? It's because you start off with punk, Luke Skywalker, and you end with Master Jedi. All of our favorite stories are our favorite stories because the characters evolve and are different and are transformed. If you can tell stories to illustrate something where your characters get transformed and evolved, you can hold people in. Other way you could illustrate is metaphors. Metaphors are incredibly powerful because you have the power to transfer the feeling that one thing gives you to the feeling of what you're describing. I'll give a great example. I was preaching a sermon. I was talking about how grace and holiness meet together and how they enrich each other. And as soon as I say grace, holiness debate in a church setting, most people are like, yeah, let's fight, let's argue, grace versus holiness showdown, And I realized those words they feel contradictory. They make you feel tense is the feeling. And so I said, grace and holiness are salted caramel. You have to savor God's holiness before you can fully appreciate the sweetness of God's grace. Now, what did I do there? I took something that evoked a feeling of tension, grace versus holiness, and I used a metaphor to liken it to something pleasant. And then it made you feel pleasant about grace and holiness coming together. That is what metaphors do. That is their power. C, visual aids. Pulling object lessons, and I find that's an incredible opportunity. I find the best object lessons are things that are already in the audience, and illustrating like that. If that's your style, that's your style. Jackets, chairs, you can use those things. D, diagrams. As you'll see, I'm also a huge fan of illustrations through diagrams. And showing charts. I think that makes, especially if you're doing some kind of complex biblical theology parallel, charts make everything 10 times clearer. Movie clips. If that's your style, movie clips are great and can be a really effective way to communicate. Pictures. I love to put pictures in, and I think that people are very visual. It really helps them. Demonstrations. You can act things out and do demonstrations. And always, I love to create opportunities for audience interaction. I hate recording with no audience. I'm even tempted. I see the sound guy back there, and I'm tempted to use him for some kind of illustration because it's driving me nuts that there's nobody that I can use to demonstrate things. And so, awesome. And so, explanations, illustrations, arguments. C. This is a really effective way to kind of make your points come alive, is to take your big idea and explain to someone an objection that they might have and rebut it. Remember, this goes back to what is the main goal of preaching biblically, and it's to produce faith in the truth. To produce faith in the truth. And so what you're doing is you're going to war with whatever doubt someone might have over what you are communicating about. And so you state why someone would object, and then you rebut it. It's a great, simple way to prove your point. And it's really pastorally effective to know if my thesis is God is good, I need to have a pulse on what reasons would someone in this room object to believing that. And this is your time to directly address them. Arguments. And then 13D, application/vision casting. So that is moving into points of really practically what does this mean for my life? You give points of application that say, okay, we talked about God is good. What does it mean to believe God is good in your day-to-day life? And these can often get informed by your counseling interactions, by your interactions with people and what they're suffering with, and show them how does this apply? And kind of my favorite form of application, and Chip does this so effectively, is vision casting. They've done studies that if churches, when they're doing a capital campaign to build a building, if they do this one thing, I don't know the exact number, but giving for a capital campaign to build a building just shoots right up if they do this one thing. And that one thing is to build a 3D model of the building that you're building and put it in your foyer. You know what happens? People can see it, and they start giving. So vision casting is application in language that is very visual, or even in pictures, that I've got to mentally draw a picture of us living out whatever I'm calling us to do. Drawing a picture of what it would look like to live that out. And so that is a great thing to spice up your sermon and get people motivated. Vision is what really motivates people, things they can see in vision casting. And transitions. Just be intentional about how am I going to go from this point to the next point. Always have that figured out in your mind when you are writing a message. Page 14, number 4. So after you've gotten your big idea, you've made your message outline, you've had explanations, illustrations, arguments, application, vision casting, and transitions. I always end creating these details by writing an introduction and conclusion. Almost every good speaker that I've heard talk about how they write their messages says, I write my introduction and my conclusion after I've written everything else. I write my introduction and my conclusion after I've written everything else. Wow. So that becomes much easier. And so introductions. When you're writing your introduction, you need to be aware that here's several things you might need to do in your introduction. What your goal is in your introduction is to catch their attention. You've got a few seconds to make them think, I want to listen to what this guy's got to say. I want to listen to what this girl's got to say. I want to hear exactly what they're going to say. They have caught me. And you've got to do that at the beginning or you lose people. And so in order to do this, you may want to focus on one of their problems that they're feeling, they're hurting. I believe it's Andy Stanley who said, if you speak to hurting people, you will always have an audience. If you speak to people's pain points, you will always have an audience. And so several things you may need to do during an introduction. This is starting on the bottom of page 14. A, establish your credibility. You may need to prove that what you're talking about is something you need to talk about. Now, that may be as, saying, hey, I've preached for 10 years, so I know what I'm talking about when I talk about preaching, or stating your credibility. What makes me qualified to speak on this topic? B, outline. Sometimes in your introduction, if it's going to be kind of complex material, you might want to, and you'll see that I do this. I showed you an outline of where I was going so that it would be simpler. I said, the outline of what we're doing today is pray, study, write, internalize, pray. You had a grid. Why? Because the human brain can't understand the details until it understands the big picture. What I just said is a profound statement about how the human brain works. If you understand that, you can speak with much more clarity. The human brain cannot understand the details until it understands the big picture. I don't have anybody here to do this illustration, but I always do this. I always say, okay, I'm going to put you in a time machine, and I'm going to give you a hubcap. I'm going to send you back to the prehistoric age. And assuming that you can speak English, they can speak English. You're going to meet a caveman, and you've got the hubcap. And that caveman is going to look at you and say, what is that? How do you explain it? If you look at him and you say a hubcap, it's going to make no sense. If you just say it goes in a tire, that's not going to make any sense. You've got to explain what a car is before you can explain what a hubcap is. The hubcap, the detail, doesn't have any meaning outside of the big picture of the car, right? And so that is really important to show people the big picture. Another thing you may need to do in your introduction is explain the importance of your topic. Explain the importance of your topic. If you're speaking on something that somebody is might be tempted to think is worthless, you need to explain it. When I teach an Old Testament survey class, every class I open up and explain another reason why it's important to study the Old Testament. Because I know I've got to drill into them that studying the Old Testament is important, or they're not going to care at all. And D, sometimes you need to review. In your if you're in a series, what have I already covered? Sometimes that's helpful in an introduction. And then, on page 15, after you've written your introduction, write your conclusion. And the easiest way to write a conclusion is to allude back to however you got somebody's attention in your introduction. You want to land it and make your sermon land. So, introduction, conclusion. And E, this is my controversial statement. I don't know that you'll always need to do this, but if you're growing in sermon writing, this will help you a lot, is writing out. You've got this bulk of what's going on, writing out all of this in a word-for-word manuscript of your sermon. I would never want you to read it from a manuscript because that's boring. That being said, it helps you mentally work through where you're going and what you're saying and what you're doing, right? And I used to require that my students write out a manuscript before they would give their sermons. And I suggest you do. If you don't have time, that's fine. But I could always, and some of them would say, I bet I can do it, and he won't be able to tell whether or not I've written a manuscript. And I could 100% of the time tell who had written out a manuscript and who hadn't, because the ones, especially if you're new to preaching, who hadn't written out a manuscript, they would stumble and say, and they wouldn't know exactly how they were going to transition. They wouldn't exactly know how they were going to phrase things. They would trip over. So eventually you don't have to write a manuscript, but I will suggest that if you are starting out in preaching, write manuscripts, word-for-word manuscripts. And if you're in this class, you can send it to me, and I will review it. All right. So explanations, illustrations, sorry. Conclusion. All right. So we've written our message. And so pray, study, write. And step 4, internalize. What do I mean by internalize? I used to try to memorize my sermon, but then I realized there's something much more effective than memorizing your sermon, because that's really hard and takes a long time. Better than memorizing your sermon, you need to sit down and understand your sermon. You need to understand, wrap your mind, these are my major points, bam, 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 and this is how they each build upon each other. And as soon as you understand that, you essentially have your sermon effectively memorized. You can work through it and push through it to communicate it well. And so, and it's also the process of getting the sermon in you. Martin Lloyd-Jones made the statement that you can't just prepare the message, you have to also prepare the messenger. You cannot just prepare the message, you have to also prepare the messenger. That I can't communicate this message that I've written effectively to you if I haven't first communicated it to me. I've got to get this message in me. One of the things that I always do before I preach a message is I take my main points and I ask God to give me faith in them, that I can believe them. I can't sell you something I wouldn't buy. That's insincerity. But if I can get it in me, if I can meditate on it, if I can get the points in me, one of my heroes, A.W. Tozer, they would say that when he was in his throughout his week in his office, what he would do is he would go in his office during the day, and he had a pair of trousers, kneeling trousers. He would throw off his formal trousers and get down and kneel, and he would open up hymn books. And he would find a hymn that was pertinent on whatever he was preaching. If it was a hymn on the love of God, it would be Amazing Love. If it was a hymn on God's holiness, it would be Holy, Holy, Holy. And he had millions of hymns in his office. And he would just sit there and he would worship and commune with the Lord over the thing that he was going to communicate. And it would get it in him and make it alive to him and thus produce unction when he communicated it. Phase 5, internalize and pray. Pray. This is where you're praying. I'm just insistent that you end your message with preparation with prayer. You're praying that God would produce faith in the message. You're praying for the people you're speaking to, that they would believe this, that they would buy into it, that they would see it, that they would produce faith, and that you would be able to shoot down the doubts that are coming up. And I think it's so important to take your message and pray it before the Lord and ask God to produce faith in it. And so I hope those are helpful. If you're taking my class, you can call me and I will help you review your manuscript if you get it into me by Wednesday, July 24th. And I want to help you. I hope this has been helpful. Shoot me a call with any questions. Thanks. Have a great week sermon prepping.